Hi, I'm Dewayne Pate, and today we're going to be exploring the world of two-handed tapping. Now, two-handed tapping has become really popular among bass players these days, and we're going to be talking about a lot of different techniques, so it doesn't matter if you're a beginner and you've just started to get into tapping, or if you've been doing it quite a while. Chances are there'll be something in this video for you. And like I said, we're going to be talking about a lot of different techniques, and some of the things we're going to be talking about, for instance, are cross-string tapping, slapping and tapping together, playing bass lines and comping at the same time, playing bass lines and melody lines at the same time, and some other things. But before we get into any of that, there's a couple practice habits I'd like to talk about that I think are real important. And the first one is using a metronome. Now, there's a couple really good reasons for using a metronome. The first reason is it helps develop good time. And I'll say it right off the bat, if you're not practicing with a metronome, you're wasting your time. It's just as important as having strings on your bass. So get into the habit of practicing with a metronome. Now, the second good reason is it can be a really good gauge for your progress. And what I mean by that, suppose you've got a lick or an exercise you're working on at 60 beats per minute, but you want to get it up to a much faster tempo, say 150 or 200. All you have to do is push the metronome up little by little each day, and in a couple weeks from now or a month from now, when you're up to 200, you can look back and say, whoa, you know, I started at 60, now I'm at 200, and that can be a really good incentive for you to keep practicing. The progress is right there in front of you. Now, the other practice habit I'd like to talk about real briefly is playing things slowly. Remember, it's always best to play something slow and clean and fast and sloppy. So when you're practicing, start your licks, your exercises off real slow and work your way up to a faster tempo. All right, before we go any further, let's tune up. Starting with your G string. Now your D string. Now your A string. Now the E. Right now we should do a little bit of talking about the setup of the bass. Now, I tend to keep my action fairly low, and this can be especially important if you're a beginner with this stuff. The object is to set up your strings at a height that feels comfortable for tapping so you get a good clean sound without having to hammer too hard. But at the same time, you want to get a minimal amount of fret noise. Now, it's usually a pretty easy procedure to raise or lower your action depending on what kind of bridge you have. But if you can't figure it out, you might want to take it to an instrument repair shop and have them do it for you. Let's start by looking at a simple slapping and tapping exercise. Now, traditionally, a hammer-on is played by plucking a note first, then hammering your finger down while the string is still vibrating in order to sound the next note. However, by hammering hard enough like this, the string will vibrate on its own without having to actually pluck anything. Now, with pull-offs, you're sort of plucking the string with your left hand and setting it into motion as you pull off to make the lower note sound like this. Now, what we're going to be exploring on this tape is the use of both the right and left hands together to play hammer-ons and pull-offs. Now, Now pull-offs can be a little bit tricky because you can run into other strings when you're doing your pull-offs and make all kinds of weird noises that you don't want to make. So right now we're going to do some exercises that will help clean up your sound. The first exercise sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the main problem with pull-offs is hitting other strings that you don't want to hit, like this. What you want to do is just gently touch the other string enough to dampen it. I'm just barely touching it. It's almost impossible not to hit it at all, but just gently dampen it. Now let's talk about your directions of your pull-offs. When you're doing pull-offs in the right hand, it's most comfortable to pull off in an upward motion, like that. And when you're pulling off with your left hand, it's most comfortable to pull off in a downward motion, like that. Let's take another look at that from overhead. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we'll turn that around for the next exercise and play it like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now all we're doing there is kind of doing the whole thing backwards. Instead of starting with this hammer on and that pull off, we're going to start with this hammer on and that pull off. Now keep in mind the object of this is to keep from hitting strings that you don't want to hit. So let's do it again. 1, 2, 3, 4. So in our next exercise, we're going to combine both hammer-ons and pull-offs in a simple one-string C major scale. And this is how it should sound. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now all I'm doing there is holding down the C for the entire exercise, and I'm kind of using the C and the D as common tones to pivot off from. And then I'm just starting on E and working my way up the scale and then back down. And you'll also notice that my thumb rests on top of the neck and my ring finger is hooked underneath as I slide up and down the neck. Now this kind of acts as a guide so that my hand doesn't wander around too much. So let's try this again at a faster tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'd like to show you how I can apply this technique in a soloing situation. And this is kind of a hip thing. What we're going to do is play some hammer-ons and pull-offs on a simple one-string major scale to form modes over the various chords. For instance, if we take that C major scale and we play the first three notes of the scale, C, D, and E, and play some hammer-ons and pull-offs around those notes, that's the first degree or first mode of the scale. And those notes will work for anything revolving around C major. And then if we take the next three notes of the scale, D, E, and F, that's the second degree or second mode of the scale, and those notes will work for anything revolving around D minor. Then if we take the next three notes of the scale, E, F, and G, that's the third degree or third mode of the scale. Those notes will work for anything revolving around E minor. Then Then if we take the next three notes of the scale, F, G, and A, that's the fourth degree or fourth mode of the scale. And those notes will work for anything revolving around F major. Then if we take the next three notes of the scale, G, A, and B, that's the fifth degree or fifth mode of the scale. And those notes will work for anything revolving around G7. Now if we take the next three notes of the scale, A, B, and C, that's the sixth degree or sixth mode of the scale, and those notes will work for anything revolving around A minor. Then if we take the next three notes of the scale, B, C, and D, that's the seventh degree or seventh mode of the scale, and those notes will work for anything revolving around B half diminished. So now I'm going to demonstrate this with the band, and I'm going to take a four-chord progression moving from D minor 7 to E flat major to C minor to A flat major. And I'm going to use a lot of the same modes we just talked about. Let's take this basic technique one step further now and get into some cross-string tapping. Now, this can be a really good way to help your right hand coordination on the neck so you start to get the feel for where each one of the strings are. Now you want to get real comfortable with this so you can nail whichever string you want when you want without missing. And that can be real hard when you're playing at faster tempos. For this first example, I'm going to hold down an F7 chord in the left hand like this. And I'm going to do some hammer-ons and pull-offs all on the 15th fret. And first I'll start with just my index finger, like that. But what you eventually want to do is get your other fingers into the picture, at least your first three, like this. So let's try that with the click. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alright, now in example 2, we're going to throw some plucking with our right thumb into the picture. It'll be in a downward motion like this. So let's play this with a click, and I'm going to also throw in some variations. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now all I'm doing there is playing some notes that sound good against the chord. So just try it out and experiment a little bit. And if it sounds good, go with it. We'll get more into the theory of which notes to use in the next section. Right now, just use your ears. Now like we talked about before, you can use this technique for a soloing technique, or you can just use it for accompaniment behind another soloist. So now let's take a more interesting chord progression. Let's go from B major 7 to F sharp minor 7 to G sharp minor 7 to G major 7, and this will be in 7/4 time. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now I'd like to apply these hammer-on and pull-off techniques to playing some specific arpeggios. Now an arpeggio is simply just a broken up chord played note by note. And although we were breaking up the chords in the previous section, we were basically only tapping notes that sounded good against the chord. Now I want to get a little bit more specific, which is going to involve a little bit of talking about theory, but just Hang in there for a minute because this is also going to help develop the concept of working each hand independently, which is going to be real important for the stuff we're doing later in the video. Now what we're going to do here is take 5 basic chord types: major, minor, dominant, diminished, and augmented. And we're going to play 7th arpeggios as opposed to just playing 1, 3, and 5. This way we can get more fingers and more notes into the picture. And when I say 1, 3, and 5, all I'm referring to is the degrees of the major scale. So let's take a look at a C major 7 arpeggio first. Now on the left hand you have your root, a C, then you have the 3rd, an E. In the right hand you have a G, the 5th, and a B, the 7th. Now if you were to play the C major 7 arpeggio in the traditional way, you'd play it all in the left hand like this, which you can see a little bit better on the left hand side of the screen. But we're going to break these arpeggios up into both hands just so we can get more fingers into the picture. So now let's take a look at a C minor 7 arpeggio, which you can play in a couple different ways. The first way, in the left hand you'll have your root here, your flat 3rd here, and in your right hand you'll have your 5th and your flat 7 here, and you can see those last 2 notes a little bit easier on the right hand side of the screen. Now you can also play this arpeggio like this. In the left hand you can play your root here and your flat 3rd here, and in the right hand it would be the same. You'd have your 5th and your flat 7th. Now let's take a look at a C dominant 7 arpeggio, where in the left hand you have your root, your 3rd, and in the right hand you have your 5th and a flat 7th. Now let's take a look at a C half diminished arpeggio, where in the left hand you have your root, your flat 3rd, and in the right hand you have a flat 5th and a flat 7th. Now let's take a look at a C fully diminished arpeggio, where in the left hand again we have our root here and our flat 3rd here, and in the right hand you have your flat 5th and a 6th. Now our last arpeggio is going to be a C augmented arpeggio, where in the left hand you'll have your root, your 3rd, and in the right hand you'll have your sharp 5 and a flat 7th. Now you can also experiment with some more complex chord types. For instance, you could take something like a C major 9 arpeggio, where in the left hand you'll have your root, your 3rd, and then in the right hand you'll have your 7th and your 9th degree, which is the same as the 2nd degree of the scale except an octave higher. Or you could take something like a C7 sharp 11 arpeggio, where in the left hand you'll have your root, your sharp 11, and your 11th degree is the same as the 4th degree except an octave higher, and in the right hand you'll have your flat 7 and your 3rd. Or you could take something like a C7 sus arpeggio, where in the left hand you'll have your root, your 3rd, and then in the right hand you'll have your flat 7 and your sus or 4th degree of the scale. Now there are a lot of different ways to finger these arpeggios, and most of the patterns I've chosen are easy to visualize because most of them start with a root. The idea here is to get familiar with the many different fingering possibilities for the different chord types and the position of the arpeggio patterns in relation to the root of the chord. So now I'm going to give you an example of these arpeggio hammer-ons over a 2-chord progression. This pattern will go from an A minor 7 to an F major 7. And I'll play this with a triplet feel. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alright, let's take a look at what we have here. This is basically all hammer-ons. We'll start in the left hand with a hammer of an A, and then a hammer of an E, and then in the right hand we've got a hammer of a G, and a hammer of a C. And then you just go back down. So that would be like this. Now, over the F major, we start in the left hand with a hammer of an F, then a hammer of a C, and then in the right hand we've got a hammer of an E and a hammer of an A, and then you just go back down, and that would be like this. So let's try this real slow with the click. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you can also do this with pull-offs, and that would be like this. You start off with the hammer-ons, A, E, G, C, and on the way down, instead of doing this, you're going to do a pull-off on the G, like that. And then over the F major, you start off with your hammer-ons, F, C, E, A, and on the way down, instead of doing this, you're going to do a pull-off on the E, like that. So let's do this again with a click. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can also try different fingerings and mixing up the notes of the arpeggios. For instance, instead of playing this arpeggio like this, 1, 5, 7, 3, you can mix the notes up by dropping that A an octave down here and playing it like this, 1, 5, 3, 7. Now you can also do some slides in the right hand like this. Alright, so now let's take a 4-chord sequence and expand the harmony a little bit. For this example, I'm going to hold down the root of the chord with my left hand, and we're going to go from an A minor 7 to G major 7 to F major 7 to E minor 7. And I'll play the same kind of arpeggio patterns up on top with my right hand. And this will be in 3/4 time. 1, 2, 3. The next thing I'd like to add into the picture are double stops. So let me give you a quick example of how those can be used. 1, 2, 3, 4. A double stop is simply playing two notes at the same time to create some harmony. Now combined with the left hand, you can actually create chords by playing the root and the double stop together. So now I'd like to start by giving you a few examples of some double stops over three basic chord types: major, minor, and dominant. Now these examples are all going to be in the key of C. I'm going to hold down the root here in my left hand and then play the double stop in my right hand. And the combination of the root and the double stop together will form the key notes of each chord. Here are some double stop possibilities for C major. I'm going to hold down the root here, but keep in mind you also have a root here. And we're going to be playing most of the double stops in this area, so it's actually easier to visualize this root here and then playing the whole chord like this. So let's take some examples in C major now. Our first examples, we have C in the root, and we have E the third and G the fifth to form a simple C major chord. Now our second example, we're going to keep C in the root, add an E the third, and then an A the sixth to form or imply a C6 chord. Keep in mind you can also visualize your root here and play the whole chord like this. Now a third example in C major, we're going to go back to our root here. We're going to add an E, the third, and then a B, the seventh, and form or imply a C major 7 chord. Now let's move to C minor. We'll keep our root here. In our first example, we'll take an E flat, the flat third, and a G to form a simple C minor chord. In our second example, we're going to take C again in the root. We'll take that E flat again, the flat third, and then a B flat, the flat seventh, to imply a C minor 7 chord. Keep in mind you can also play the whole chord like this. In our third example in C minor, we'll go back to our root, and we'll take a D, the second or the 9th degree of the scale, and then a B flat, the flat 7th, and imply a C minor 9 type chord. Now let's look at C dominant, or C7. Keep our root here. In our first example, we'll take an E, the third, and a B flat, the flat 7th, and we'll imply a simple C7 chord. Now in our second example, we're also going to imply a simple C7 chord, but instead of the third, we'll have the fifth here. We'll have a C in the root, fifth, the G, and a B flat, the flat 7th, like that. In our last example, we'll take C in the root, we'll take an F, the sus, or the 4th degree, and then a B flat, the flat 7th, to imply a C7 sus type sound. You could also play that like this, the whole chord. Now these are only a few of the double stop options. You might want to take some time out to work out some other possibilities on your own. And I also like to mention, and this may be obvious, that these patterns are all movable on the neck, so you can play them in any key. For instance, if you're playing in C major, you can move that whole thing up 2 frets to the key of D major. So just keep these patterns in mind as we move throughout the different tonalities. Now this next example, let's take a 2-chord sequence moving from E minor 7 to D major, and I'll play that with a click. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alright, let's take a look at what we're doing here. In the left hand, over the E minor 7 chord, we're just going to be going back and forth between an E and a B, like that. And then for the D major chord, we drop it down 2 frets, and we'll be going back and forth between a D and an A, like that. Now to make up the E minor 7 chord in the right hand, we'll do a double stop of D and G, like that. And then for the D major chord, we'll do a double stop of D and A, like that. So let's play this again. I'm going to throw in some rhythmic variations. 1, 2, 3, 4. In our next example, we're going to take the same two chords, E minor 7 to D major, and we're going to mix up the sequence of the left and right hands, so it should sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alright, let's take a look at what we're doing here. One thing's going to be different. The examples we've done up to this point, we've pretty much started all the activity out in the left hand. Now we're going to start this off with the activity in the right hand with some double stop hammer-ons. Now the double stop hammer-on over E minor 7 is going to be G and D, like that. And then over the D major, we're going to do a double stop hammer-on of A and D, like that. Now in the left hand, over the E minor 7, we're just going to go back and forth between an E and a B, like that. Then over the D major, you just drop that down a couple frets, and you're going to go back and forth between a D and an A, like that. So let's do this slow with a click. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, now I'm going to do this again up the tempo with the click, and I'm going to throw in some fills and some runs in my left hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we'll use these same techniques and move to a different key center. This time we'll go from F7 sus to E flat 7 sus, and we'll play that a few times. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alright, let's take a look at what we have here. First in the left hand, I'm just holding down an F7 chord like this. Now in the right hand, I've got a double stop hammer-on of B flat and E flat, like that. And then you do a double stop pull-off like this. And then you pluck down with your thumb. And then you do another double stop hammer-on of the B flat and E flat like this. And that's basically the whole motion. And then you just drop the whole thing down to E flat. Now as you can notice, my ring finger here is anchored along the bottom of the neck like we talked about before, and it just kind of slides along like that. So let's try this again with the drum machine, and I'm going to throw in some variations. I'd like to close this section out by showing you how you can combine all these techniques into a soloing situation, and hopefully give you a feel for how you can use these techniques in a more spontaneous way. 1, 2, 3, 4. In this next section, I'd like to talk about playing slapping and tapping together like this. We're going to start this section off by doing a number of examples in the key of E. Now, a lot of bass players like to slap in the key of E because you've got this nice big fat open E string to pivot off of. Now, the intimate details of slapping have already been covered in the slap bass program video. So what we're going to be dealing with here specifically is playing slapping and tapping together to create some really unique bass parts. Let's start by looking at a simple slapping and tapping exercise. All right, let's look at what we have here. Our first move is a slap of the open E string, and then we have a hammer-on on fret 7, your E, and then we have another hammer-on of A, like that, and then we go back to our hammer-on of an E on the 7th fret. And the only thing you change about that in the second half is instead of hammering down this A, you hammer down a D. So the whole thing would sound like this. Now there's only one other thing I'm doing here. I'm doing some damping in my left hand, and how I'm doing that is at the same time I'm hammering down this E, I'm gently touching the open E string to dampen it. So here's the open E string without dampening, and now I'm going to gently touch it to dampen it, and you'll hear the difference. So let's play it again with the click. Now let's add some double stops into the picture, and this is what it should sound like. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, let's look at what we have here. Our first move, again, is an open E string, it's thumb slap, like that. And then we have a hammer-on the 7th fret of an E, like that, and then we have a double stop hammer-on of A and D, like that, and then we go back to our E hammer-on the 7th fret, and that's it. The only thing you change in the second half, you change the double stop hammer-on from A and D to G sharp and D, like that. And again, I'm doing the same kind of damping in my left hand. So let's play this again with a click. Now in this next example, we'll just double up on the thumb and add a pluck like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's take a look at that. Our first move we have is 2 successive thumb slaps on open E. I'm going to call that one move, like that. And then we have a pluck of a D on the 7th fret, and I'm plucking with my middle finger on my right hand. And then we've got a thumb slap of a D on the 5th fret, like that. And then we've got a hammer of an E. And then we've got a double stop hammer-on of A and D, like that. And then hammers of D and E on the 5th and 7th fret. Now the only thing you change in the second half, again, you just change the double stop hammer-on from A and D to G sharp and D. Now I'm also doing some damping with my right hand in this example. And I'm doing the damping right here in the back of my right hand. So first I'm going to let the open E string ring out, like that, and then I'm going to dampen it like this. So let's try this real slow with a click. Now let's try that up to tempo with the click. Now let's combine all the techniques from the 3 previous examples, and this will be a little bit faster tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, let's take a look at what we have here. We're going to break this down into 2 sections. Now our first move in the first section is a double stop hammer-on of A and D, like that, and then we have hammer-ons of D and E on the 5th and 7th fret, and then we've got a muted thumb slap, like that, no particular note. Then we've got a pluck of a D on the 7th fret, then we've got a thumb slap on open E, and then hammer-ons of A and B on the 5th and 7th fret. So that whole section sounds like this. Now in the second section, our first move is a double stop hammer-on of A and D, like that. Then we have hammer-ons of D and E on the 5th and 7th fret. Then we have another double stop hammer-on of B and E. And then we go back to our double stop hammer-on of A and D. And then our last move is hammer-ons of D and E on the 5th and 7th fret. So that section sounds like this. Now the only thing you change in the second half of this example is instead of doing this, you'll do this. You just change the double stops up a little bit. You'll do a double stop of G sharp and D. So let's play this whole thing very slowly with the click. All right, let's do that up to tempo with the click. Now we're going to do that same exercise, and I'm going to throw in some variations, mostly in the right hand. I'm going to throw in some rhythmic variations and some different double stops, and I'll do that with a drummer. All right, in example number 5, we're going to start slowly getting away from the key of E. This is going to be a 2-chord sequence moving back and forth from E to D to make a 4-chord phrase. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, let's take a look at what we have here. A couple things to talk about first. There's a couple challenges to this. The more we get away from the key of E, the more we're going to have less open E strings here and open A strings and such to pivot off from. For instance, in this example, when we're going off the E sus and E7 chord, we'll still be able to pivot off this open E. But when we move down to the D sus and D7, we're going to be pivoting off this A here on the 5th fret, which is the 5th of the chord. So just keep that in mind. Now we're going to break this down into 4 sections. So let's take a look at the first section. First move in the first section is going to be a thumb slap on open E, like that. And then we've got a thumb slap of an open A. And then we've got hammers of D and E on the 5th and 7th fret. And then we've got 2 double stop hammer-ons of A and D, and then B and E. So that would sound like this. That's the first section. Now the second section, our first move is a thumb slap of open E, and then hammers of D and E, and then 2 double stop hammer-ons of A and D, and G sharp and D. So that section would sound like this. Now a third section, our first move is going to be 2 successive thumb slaps on A, like that, and then a thumb slap of C, a hammer of a D, and then 2 double stop hammer-ons of G and C and A and D. So that section would sound like this. Now our fourth section and our last section, our first move is going to be this: a thumb slap of an A, thumb slap of a C, hammer of a D, and then 2 double stop hammer-ons of G and C and F sharp and C. So that section would sound like this. So let's play this whole thing real slow with the click. Alright, let's play this again with a drum machine, and I'm going to throw in some harmonic variations in my right hand. Now all I did there was change up the order of the double stops, and I also played some double stops that just simply sounded good against the chord. Now we're going to play that same example, and I'm going to mess around with the double stops some more, but I'm also going to change things up rhythmically and get more activity happening in both hands. In this next example, we're going to finally totally get away from the key of E, and we're going to move to a totally different key center. We're going to take that same 4-chord progression that we used in the previous example, except now we'll move it down to A sus to A7, and then G sus to G7. So let me play a little bit of this for you, and then we'll talk about it. Alright, let's see what we have here. First thing I'd like to mention is that there's going to be very few open strings to pivot off from in this exercise. The only open strings will be when I do this triplet figure, like that. Right, let's break this down into two sections. In the first section, our first move is going to be a thumb slap of an A, and then a pluck of an A octave, and then our triplet figure, which I just talked about, is a slap on open A, and then hammers of D and E, like that. And then the last move, we have two double stop hammer-ons of G and D, and then G and C sharp. So that whole section sounds like this. Now in our second section, our first move is a thumb slap on D, then a hammer of an E, then a muted thumb slap, then a pluck of a C, then a hammer of a C sharp, and then thumb slap of an A, and then hammers of G and A. So that section sounds like this. Then you just move that whole thing down 2 frets and do it in the key of G. So let's play this again slow with the click. Alright, let's do that up to tempo with the click. This next example will move through 3 different chords, C7, B flat 7, and F7. And this will be a little bit tricky because it's in 5/4 time. There are also some double stop pull-offs in this, and you'll find that the further you go down with your left hand on the neck towards the nut, the harder it is to get a really beefy tone out of your hammer-ons. So let's try this with the click. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alright, let's take a look at what we have here. We're going to break this down into 4 sections. Now in our first section, the first move we have is a thumb slap of a C, and then we've got a pluck of a B flat, and then we've got a hammer of a C on the 5th fret, and then we've got 2 double stop hammer-ons of B flat and E flat, and G and C. So that section sounds like this. Now in our second section, our first move is a hammer of a C on the 3rd fret, and then a hammer of a C octave, and then a double stop hammer on of G and C, and then we've got a hammer of a C on the 3rd fret again, and then 2 successive thumb slaps on B flat. So that section sounds like this. Now in our third section, our first move is a thumb slap of an F, then we've got a pluck of an E flat, and then we've got a hammer of an F on the 3rd fret, and then 2 double stop hammer-ons of E flat and B flat, and E flat and A. So that section sounds like this. Now in our last section, our first move is a hammer of a B flat, and then we've got a hammer of a C on the 3rd fret, and then a double stop hammer-on of E flat and A, and then you do a double stop pull off just to a muted sound, like that. And then you've got 2 successive thumb slaps on F. So that section sounds like this. Alright, let's play this slowly with the click. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, let's play this up to tempo now with the drum machine and some variations. In this next section, we're going to talk about playing bass lines and comping at the same time. Now, comping is just an abbreviated term for accompaniment. Now, we did a little bit of this back in the arpeggio section, where I played a simple bass line in my left hand, and then played some arpeggios on top in the right hand, like this. But what we're going to do now is play some double stops on top of the bass line, and we're going to do this in a number of different musical styles. Now, this can work really well when you're playing with just a few musicians because the bass can actually fill up a lot more of the musical spectrum. For instance, you can play the role of keys and bass at the same time, or guitar and bass at the same time. So now let's try this with kind of a Latin bossa nova feel, and we'll do it over a C7 sus chord. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me break this down and show you what we're doing here. Now, in the left hand, we're just going back and forth between a C and a G, like this. But it's a little bit hard to hear when you're playing it by itself because a lot of the notes don't fall right on the beat. They're anticipated. But when you play both parts together, it all kind of falls in place. So that's what we're doing in the left hand. Now, what we're doing in the right hand is just playing a double stop of F and B flat, like this, to help make up the C7 sus chord. So now let's do this with the click. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's take that same example now and expand the harmony in both hands, both the right hand double stops and the left hand parts. This time we'll start with C minor 9 and then go to D half diminished and then G7 sharp 11. This will get a lot more activity happening in both hands. So let me play it for you and then we'll talk about it. 1, 2, 3. Let's look at the left hand first. Over the C minor 9 chord, you're just going to go back and forth between a C and a G, like this. Then the next chord, the D half diminished, you're going to go back and forth between a D and an A flat, like that. And then the last chord, the G7, you're going to go back and forth between a G and a D, like that. So let's take a look at this with the drum machine. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now for the double stops in the right hand over the C minor 9 chord, you'll have a double stop of B flat, and D. Then the next chord, the D half diminished, you just move that down 2 frets to an A flat and a C. And then for the last chord, the G7 sharp 11, you'll have a double stop of F and C sharp. Now at first you should concentrate on these lines as individual parts until you get each one of them solid, and then slowly combine the two to set up the entire groove on your own. So let's put these parts together now and play them with the click. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Alright, let's try that again now up to tempo with the drum machine. Let's try something now with the reggae feel. And just for consistency, let's stay in the basic key center of C. Except this time we'll start in C, and then we'll go down to B flat, and then down to A flat, back up to B flat, and then we'll end in C. Now in reggae, the rhythm accents always fall on beats 2 and 4, and that's where the rhythm guitar player would play his chopped chords. So we're going to simulate that by playing some staccato type double stops up here in the right hand. Alright, let's take a look at what we're doing here briefly. Now like we talked about before, in the right hand I'm going to play what the rhythm guitar player would play. Now over the C chord I'm going to play a double stop of G and C, and then we move down to the B flat chord. I go down 2 frets, do the same double stop, and then for the A flat, same thing, you move down 2 more frets, like that. Now in the second half of this, I'll keep it the same rhythmically, but I'll just change the double stops up a little bit. Now the only hard part about this whole exercise is where I do a bar of 3 against 4 type of thing, where I play some triplets in my left hand against the 8th note feel in my right hand, like this. Like that. Alright, so let's take another look at this from overhead. So now I'd like to move on to some of the fun stuff, which for me is the blues. Now what we're going to do here is take a 12/8 blues form, the key of A, and I'm going to lay down the groove in my left hand, and in my right hand I'm going to do some double stop comping. So now let's take a look at some of the double stop possibilities for the 1, 4, and 5 chords. In A7, you could do something like this. You could play a double stop of A and C sharp, going down to G and B like this. Or you could also do a double stop of F sharp and A going down to E and G. Or you can do a double stop of A and D going down to G and C. Now for D7, you could do a double stop of G and C going to F sharp and C. Or you could do a double stop of B and D going down to A and C. Now for E7, you could do a double stop of A and D to G sharp and D. Or you could do a double stop of C sharp and E going down to B and D. These are obviously just a few of the double stop possibilities. You can go back and review some of the other double stops we talked about earlier in the tape. So right now, let's play this 12/8 blues form again, and the first time I play it, I'm going to play it straight. The second time through, I'm going to add in some fills and variations. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you can also play this with a walking bass line like this. And play a lot of the same double stops on top except with a shuffle feel. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. There I'm just using a couple different rhythm comping patterns in my right hand over a simple walking bass line. Both of those parts are written out in the book, and I think you'll find it's fairly straightforward. So now let's move to a different key, the key of C. And we're going to play a straight eighth blues feel, kind of a Mustang Sally shotgun feel. So let me play a little bit of this for you, and then we'll break it down. 1, 2, 3, 4. take a look at the left hand first. Now let's take a look at the right hand, and we're going to start on the 20th fret. Now let's put both of these together. 1, 2, 3, 4. This stuff obviously works real well when you're playing with just a few musicians, but you'll find it's a lot bigger challenge when you're playing with a larger band. Now it's really important to listen to everything else that's going on and work closely with the other musicians. The object is to lay down some tasty parts that work with the groove, but that don't clutter up the overall sound or get in the way. So keep your ears open, that's the key. In this last section, we're going to take this whole concept a step further and play some bass lines and melody lines simultaneously. Now the best way to get started in this is by writing out the left and right hand parts either with notes or tablature. For instance, if you have a blues melody line like this, I would write that out on a double staff like this and put the melody line on top. That's the part that I'll learn to tap with my right hand. Then the left hand part is basically a rhythm pattern, which I would write out below the melody line. This way I can see everything laid out in relation to which notes are played together. To get everything timed out correctly, you need to visually see where each note falls in relation to the other. So let's play the 12-bar form again with the bass line and the melody lines played together. 1, 2, 3, 4. The best way to get a grasp on this is by working it out note for note. Don't worry right now about being too musical, just study the sheet music and concentrate on which notes fall where in relation to the others. Now a good place to start this is with all the left and right hand notes that occur simultaneously. And then once you're comfortable with that, you can start adding in all the other notes that fall in between. Getting this all down can seem like nothing more than a cheap circus act rather than something that feels musically inspired. But after you learn a tune like this and you play it more and more, pretty soon you start to feel relaxed and you actually start looking at the lines as independent parts. And pretty soon you'll be throwing in fills and variations or even improvising on the independent original parts that you set up. Let me show you an example of that. Let's take that same 12-bar blues form that we just played, and this time I'll throw in some fills and variations. And then we'll even segue into a totally different time feel in the middle. Then we'll come back to the basic form and the original melody line that we set up in the last example. Now these techniques and patterns are obviously movable to any key you want to play them in, but if you want to play in the key of E, you're kind of presented with a whole new set of problems. For instance, you could play your root here on the 12th fret, or you could play it on the 7th fret. But the problem with that is you really don't get a good beefy bottom end round tone. Now you could also use your open E here as the root and kind of strum down like this. But the problem with that, it gets real sloppy when you start to dig in. It gets real hard to keep from hitting the other notes. So what you can do is come from above the top of the neck like this. So now I'm going to play this 12/8 blues form again in the key of E, and I'm going to come from on the top of the neck like this, and it should sound like this. 1, 2, 3. Let's try another example in the key of E just so we can use this technique some more. This will be a straight rock feel, and it'll be a little bit tougher because there'll be more movement in the bass part. All I'm doing there is doing some hammer-ons and pull-offs on my F sharp, G, and A, and of course you've got your open E string too. And I'm also using my thumb on my left hand as kind of an anchor on the back of the neck. It's not moving at all, and I'm kind of using that as a pivot. So let's try this with the click. 1, 2, 3. In the right hand, I'm going to play the melody, and it should sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's put the two parts together. So this brings us to the end of the tape. Now we've covered a lot of information here that should give you some good tools to work with. Remember, these are just a few of the techniques that can be utilized. The sky's the limit. So take what I've given you and expand on it and try to come up with some of your own creative techniques, something that has your stamp on it. Now there's one other point I'd like to make in closing. Although a lot of the things we've covered in this tape are chop-oriented or technique-oriented, keep this in mind. It doesn't matter how good your chops are or how many innovative ideas you have. If you can't groove with the rhythm section or your time is bad, you're really going to be lost. So learn how to lay down a foundation first and then work on becoming an innovator. And learn how to play as many different styles as you can and see what you can do to give some old styles a new flavor. Go out there and be a part of what's going on, and good luck.